whirlwind tour of Eric's career at the Illinois State Museum, which is a 28-year time span. So he really spent most of his career at the Illinois State Museum, and many of the projects you've heard about already were done when Eric was at the museum. So that's the Illinois State Museum on the left, and that's Eric in his lab coat in our Natural History Hall. Let's see, how do you advance?
You should just be able to click like the right button on your arrow, or use your mouse too.
Oh, use the mouse?
Yeah, you can either hover over, yeah, you can do that, or then in the lower left, if you kind of hover over that area, there are arrows.
I see that. Okay, great. So this is the Research and Collection Center. This is our Quaternary Studies program. So Eric came to the Illinois State Museum to do work in our Quaternary Studies Center, which was founded in 1975. I love this image because it's one of the earlier images of Eric in the museum. I love the fact that he's drinking red wine and he has a cowlick. And these are some key players in the story of Eric Grimm at the Illinois State Museum. You can see Eric on the left. Ray Wood from the University of Missouri was here to give a Bodmer lecture. Bruce McMillan, the director of the Illinois State Museum and the founder of our Quaternary Studies Center, and Russ Graham, who actually brought Eric Grimm to the museum. He came in as a research associate, so he was still on soft money, but he was brought in to work on the impact statement for the potential siting of a superconducting super collider in Illinois, which actually didn't happen. We didn't get it, but we got some great data. So Eric, one of his first tasks was to core Nilsen Lake in northern Illinois, and gave us just this tremendous record of vegetation and climate change in Illinois. And that's Eric there in the camouflage hat, kneeling. And I think that's Russ behind him, because Russ told me that he actually didn't have proper clothing. Eric always had Carhartt clothing, and I think he actually owned stock in Carhartt. So he started out as on soft money, but then Jim King, who was our palynologist and also involved in the Quaternary Studies Center, took a job at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, which opened up a botany position for Eric. So Eric applied for that and was, of course, hired for that. So he left the soft money game and became a full-time employee at the Illinois State Museum. He had a pretty rapid ascent. He became full curator in '96, chair of botany and director of our landscape history program in 1999. And then finally in 2013, when I was director, I convinced him to become the director of sciences. As director of science before him and associate director, I was actually Grimm's immediate supervisor for most of his career at the museum. But as many of you know, he certainly didn't need any guidance on how to be successful. So this is his pollen lab, and one of the great things Eric did for the Illinois State Museum is he brought Pietra Mueller with him. So she was his lab and research assistant, and oftentimes did educational programs that Eric was supposed to do, but you know, he thought Pietra would do a better job of it. So he had I think we created a really unique and wonderful environment for him at the Illinois State Museum, because we had an interdisciplinary research program that looked at long-term changes in climate, landforms, plant and animal communities and distributions, and human-land interactions. I want you to note the socks with the sandals. The individual at the museum who sent me this slide actually did a blow up of that, because Eric was known for wearing socks with his sandals, which I'm from Arizona, that is totally weird and it is not done. So one of the most important things Eric did while he was at the Illinois State Museum was really found the North American pollen database. And you've heard about this and you will hear more about it later. I think Russ is going to talk about this some too when he talks about databases. But this was funded by a series of grants from NOAA and NSF, and it morphed into European pollen databases, Latin American pollen databases, and ultimately the global pollen database. And one thing he did during his tenure at the museum was continually upgrade that TILIA software and mentor people on the use of that software. I call these guys the dynamic duo. Eric and Russ were both working on databases at the same time. Eric was working on North American Pollen Database, and Russ was working on FaunMap, and then they merged the two to create Neotoma. And actually, Eric continued to work with Russ even after Russ left the museum. He actually left. He had been the chair of geology, and he left in '96 to go first to the Denver Museum and then ultimately to Penn State. But both leaders, both program builders, tremendous people to work with. So they created Neotoma. I know Russ is going to talk about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but that is a major contribution also of both their time at the Illinois State Museum. This is actually one of the many Neotoma paleoecology workshops that Eric gave, and he's given those all across the country. And in this one, you can see Russ on the left, then Jose Prado, Eric Grimm, Suzette, and Naoki Sasaki from Japan. And Eric traveled the country doing these workshops. And he was just, I think one of his strengths was he was a fabulous and generous mentor to younger scientists and scientists just getting started in a discipline, no matter their age. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the interdisciplinary research that he participated with in Illinois, and then some of his work back in the Great Plains. But first, his contributions were its breadth and depth. He was interdisciplinary. I mentioned the mentoring. And you'd already heard from Sherry and others about his coring expertise in his field work. He used multi-proxy data to study climate and vegetation change, and that's something he really brought that helped all of the scientists at the museum with their research, was this much firmer understanding of how the climate and vegetation had changed in Illinois through time. He also was very expert at age modeling, statistical analysis, and database and data sharing, and incredible grantsmanship. You know, he supported Pietra the entire time she was at the museum on soft money. This is one example, the Tonka thermokarst. Bob Warren on the left of this slide was excavating an archaeological settlement around this thermokarst. And then Eric came in and he did the stratigraphy in the thermokarst and looked at collected pollen. And we also retrieved stag moose, spruce, logs, pines and cones, aquatic snails, beetles. So classic highway archaeology project ends up being this incredibly wonderful interdisciplinary project. This is Jim King on the left. So he was the palynologist who preceded Eric at the Illinois State Museum, but he had left, and actually this is after he was long gone. He had been the director at Carnegie, and by this time he was the director at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. But Dave Nelson was doing his dissertation at the University of Illinois, so Jim wanted to come back because David was interested in using Chatsworth Bog. So again, you know, Eric was always ready to go in the field, and he was always ready to core. So this is a crew of people from the museum recoring Chatsworth Bog for David Nelson's dissertation research. And you can see Brennan Curry in the slide on the right with the purple hat. a little awkward on this here. Okay. We also did quite a lot of collaborative research with the Illinois State Geological Survey, in particular with Brandon Curry, who's going to talk later today, and with University of Wisconsin, Madison, with Jack Williams. So this was a project in the northern part of the state to really look at abrupt climate and vegetation change in the late glacial. And it was multi-proxy, and they looked at Nelson Lake, Crystal Lake, Brewster Creek, and Mastodon Lake. Another example of mentoring as a part of this project, he worked with Lila Gonzalez on Crystal Lake on the synchronization of late glacial changes and North Atlantic event stratigraphy. So always willing to help the students, and brought a lot of students through our program at the museum. This should look familiar to Buzz Nanavati. This is coring at Sweeten Pond in Missouri. Eric had cored there in '94. He was somewhat disappointed because it was a very long core, but not much time depth. And actually Buzz ended up using that core to look at fire history. So, and Eric and Buzz did a joint paper on that, on humans, fire, and ecology in the Southern Ozarks. So it ended up being tremendous research. And Buzz, he was on your committee, was he not?
Not on my committee, but influential nonetheless.
Okay, influential. And I know he also was very influential to Lila Gonzalez. You've already heard how much Eric loved the Black Hills. I mean, he was happiest in the Black Hills. So he actually negotiated with the National Forest folks in the Black Hills to do a paleoecological research project. And what he was looking for was a long stratified record. He hoped he'd find one for pollen and also vertebrates. And we worked at the Illinois State Museum and got a contract, and we worked in the hills for 3 summers. Eric worked at these iron bogs. You can see them labeled in brown. And he actually did get pollen from the iron bogs, but it was, again, not a very long sequence, so somewhat disappointed. We worked at the Kinsey site, which was a paleontological locality, and it also didn't yield the deep stratified record that we had hoped. Very interesting work done by Jeff Saunders at the Illinois State Museum. And then I worked at Ice Cave, which was an archaeological site alongside a cave. And this is actually our crew. That's Eric on the far left in the cowboy hat, standing next to my husband, Tom, who is a geologist. This was a family affair. I had my 2 kids there. Maria and Jane were there, and some other kids with staff members from the Illinois State Museum that were working on this project. We did this as a passport in time project. So some of the kids were participating in that program, which was an educational experience. And then we also had excavators who had participated in passport in time projects across the country and were really very experienced. This is one of the few pictures of Eric Grimm actually doing archaeology. You can tell he's not an archaeologist because he's wearing that cowboy hat and those gloves. Archaeologists don't wear gloves. But this is Eric's enthusiasm for the research. You know, he's not content just to stand on the sidelines and watch. He actually participates in every project that he gets pulled into. The tall gentleman in the back there is one George Jacobson. We actually let him excavate at Ice Cave. Here he's screening, which was probably more fitting for his skill level in archaeology, but we did let him do a little digging. That's Jane in the foreground, and she's sketching. Ice Cave, great site. Didn't have good bone preservation. I'm a zooarchaeologist. So again, it really didn't have the record that we were seeking to really look at the paleoecology of the Black Hills. So you heard a little bit about Parker's Pit from Rolf, and Parker's Pit was a site that Eric knew about for a long time because his dad used to visit it. And George mentioned that he was familiar with it as well. So finally, Eric coerced Russ Graham into working with him at Parker's Pit. And this is when Russ was at Penn State. And finally, they got the long stratified record. It's not pollen, it's vertebrates, but they've done some fantastic research from this project. Now I want to talk a little bit about his collaborative research on the Great Plains. You've already heard about Kettle Lake. This is work done on drought patterns for the Great Plains with Sherry Fritz and James Clark of Duke University. And you saw the coring image earlier, so I'm going to just pass through that. Here's Pietra preparing and sampling one of the cores, the barbed cores from Kettle Lake, and you've seen the polydiogram before too with the struvite. So my main point here is a lot of this collaborative research that you've heard about from other speakers was taking place while Eric was at the Illinois State Museum, and much of the pollen work, all of the pollen work, was done in the museum's Quaternary Studies Center, which we call the Landscape History Program now. This is another project more in the Northern Great Plains with Jim Clark and James Donovan. And I'm going to guess now, after looking at the clothes and the other slides, that this is Brush Lake. So we weren't sure which lake it was. Pietro looked at it for me. So a continuation of his earlier research interests in the plains. This is some of his Eastern U.S. projects. Of course, he continued to work with his close colleague on climate and vegetation change across the Eastern U.S., and a whole series of great publications came out from this. And then the incredible work in Florida at Lake Tulane with Bill Watts, the incredibly long record there, and the link to Heinrich events. And then he did another project again with Jim Clark, looking at biomass burning on local and regional scales. So I should note that this watercolor was done by Jane Allard when they went back to core again in 2020. Now I want to move a little bit because Eric's at a museum, and I want to talk about the importance of his contributions to public understanding of science and environmental change. We all know Eric as a gifted lecturer, and he was great with the public too. And so this is a workshop we did for elementary teachers, and he's covering the evolution of the landscape. So he's looking at geology and climate change and vegetation change in Illinois. And what an opportunity for teachers to have someone of his skill level actually relaying this information and giving them current science and excellent coverage of the topic. He was really gifted at explaining complex things in ways you can understand. And here, this is a tour we did for US Senator Dick Durbin. And Eric Grimm is explaining the North American pollen database and climate change in Illinois to a US Senator. And we had to actually drag Durbin out of the lab. I mean, he was so enthralled with this. And if you think this is important, isn't important, think again, because these are the people that approved funding for NSF. So a very important contribution that Eric made. He was also great at inspiring future scientists. These are the kinds of activities often he would try to get Pietro to do it, but you know, he actually really enjoyed talking to young people, and he could get them really excited about pollen. And I think that's quite an achievement. He also was great with teachers. And this is after we opened our new Natural History Hall, and I'm going to show you a few slides of this in a minute. But this was a reception where we were actually trying to get teachers to use the museum as a resource and use our Natural History Hall in teaching science to their students. And he enjoyed himself at these kinds of events. I mean, you might have to drag him there, but once he got there, he actually really enjoyed it. This is a lecture he gave when we opened our new Natural History Hall in 2004. And you've probably all seen him. He doesn't get behind the podium. He stands out at the side. He's totally relaxed. And he had these people eating out of his hand. And at the end of the lecture, he asked them, you know, how many of them felt that humans were contributing to detrimental climate change? They all raised their hands after his lecture. So he was excellent at communicating with the public, and as a museum person, this was an important part of his job. This is our Natural History Hall. It's a unique exhibit in that it looks at environmental change through time in Illinois from the distant past to today, and it also looks at the forces of change, including human actions. And it actually presents original research from our landscape history program. So this is not a cookie cutter exhibit. This is a very personal exhibit that the curators, and especially Eric, were instrumental in creating. And here he is explaining, you know, freeze and thaw. He's looking at glacial, interglacial cycles in Illinois. And this is he's training the people who are going to work in the exhibit and answer questions in the exhibit. So again, a very important task. He was very important on the aspects of the exhibit dealing with the Pleistocene and also Holocene, not so much the earlier periods. But here he's explaining a full glacial forest tundra diorama to, these are some of the docents again who are going to work in the exhibit. We probably are the only exhibit on Earth that has pollen diagrams in the interpretive materials and really goes through how to read them and how to understand them. This is a very important diagram for a Sangamon interglacial site that Jeff Saunders worked at, the Hopwood Farm. So again, we're presenting our own research in this exhibit. This is something Eric was really proud of, because this actually allowed visitors to try their hand at identifying pollen. And if you identified the grain, then you actually could interact with the North American pollen database and see changes in distribution of the species through time. So very exciting to actually take scientific research and present it to the public, and he was absolutely instrumental in all of this. He was also very instrumental in the late Holocene, looking at human impacts on the landscape, and especially in our Prairie diorama, which is late Holocene, looking at the role of Native American burning on the maintenance of the prairie in the late Holocene when we had a climate change back to moister environments. So again, very important work. He was also very active during his entire tenure at the Illinois State Museum. This is him as AMQA president presenting the 2007 Distinguished Career to Plains archaeologist Ray Wood, and the 2008 to our friend Bill Watts that we've heard about in numerous talks today. So Eric was very, very active in his various professional organizations. When he was president, I was the secretary of AMQA. In fact, I was the secretary of AMQA for 10 years, and Eric and I commonly got in the car and drove from Springfield to Denver when GSA met in Denver. This is the award that Eric got that he was most proud of, was the Distinguished Career Award from AMQA in 2016. He also got many other awards recognizing his contributions. One of the things that Eric loved was field trips and campouts, and he was often the instigator of those. Bruce McMillan had the director of the museum in the middle there with the plaid flannel shirt, had an annual camp out on his farm along the Meramec River. And these were family affairs, so staff and family, board members, secretaries in the museum, quite a diverse group, but really beneficial for getting people to work together, but also to play together. This is an interesting story. So the Meramec farm along Bruce's Meramec farm along the river there was actually purchased from Ed Cushing's family. So Ed and his siblings, Eric's advisor, Ed Cushing, and his siblings owned this property, and Bruce and Virginia bought the farm from them. And this is Ed actually on the right in the purple hat, and Bruce on the left Eric on the far left, and Bruce and Ray Wood in the middle. And Ed came on that trip, and he and Eric had this running dialogue of the vegetation. This is another spontaneous field trip with many of the same players you're going to see throughout the museum history. There's Eric on the left, Bruce McMillan next to him, plains archaeologist Ray Wood, Virginia McMillan in the back, and paleontologist Jeff Saunders. So these trips were running studies of the geology, the vegetation, and the archaeology of the area. So they were not just fun, they were incredibly educational. This is Eric and Jeff Saunders and the Devil's Icebox Cave, which is in Rockbridge State Park. So we commonly visited caves, and oftentimes we were looking for ones that might be good to get involved with for research. There's a great picture of plains archaeologist Ray Wood and Eric Grimm in the state park. Ray was very instrumental in our campouts and our field trips. And one of the things that Ray did for us is he gave us 2 field trips on the upper Missouri River. And these, again, they were staff, they were family members, all of our kids. Eric is an expert on Great Plains archaeology, so they're running dialogues on the prehistory and Native American lifeways in the area, the geology, with Grimm handling the vegetation. So just an incredible experience. This is our 1999 trip, and this is Jane and Eric in their canoe. Jane's taking a little rest there as they go through the White Cliffs area on the trip. This is one of our campsites. So these are all of our camp trips are tent camping experiences where we're doing our own cooking. This is Virginia McMillan, Bruce McMillan, and Eric Grimm fiddling with his camera on our trip. And you can see the bottle of wine. I always brought box of wine, which they all poo-pooed until their bottles ran out, and then they would all be in my campsite. This is the Grimm family. So our families came on these trips. So this is a box canyon near the campground, and there's Jane, Eric, and Maria. And Eric was happiest on these trips. Here he is smiling. And I think someone mentioned earlier, and probably everyone has mentioned it, but one of the greatest things that came out of Eric's 28 years at the museum were these incredible lasting friendships. These are 2 trips that we made to Columbia after Bruce retired. Ultimately, he and Virginia moved to Columbia, Missouri. So you can see on the left, the Grimms and the McMillans. On the right, Eric and me and the McMillans. This is in 2016 and 2017. This is the last camp out we got to do with Eric. In October of 2020, Eric and Jane called and said, let's do it again, because we hadn't done one for a while, and we always did these in October. So in a very short notice, the Grimms, Stiles, and McMillans went back to the Meramec River Farm in Stillville and had a camp out, and it was glorious. This is after we had just done a search for some pawpaw trees, but I think Eric and my husband Tom are having a big debate over ironwood trees. This is I love this picture. This is Eric. I think that he was preparing to go fly fishing in the Meramec River. And you've already saw pictures of him and George Jacobson fly fishing in the Black Hills. This was his love, was fly fishing. And again, all of us, we had a social distance camp out. We didn't think this would be the last one we get to do with Eric, but we treasure it. So I just want to thank the people that loaned me slides and helped me figure out some of the slides. And special thanks to Jane and Maria for sharing Eric Grimm with us.